and we're now in a new era of partnership with China. We've seen since the beginning of the year, there's lots of disruptions around the world. Maybe Venezuela, maybe Iran, maybe obviously a lot of unpredictability south of our border. To say it, there are a lot of things that we cannot control, but there are lots of things we can control.
Ministers Mélanie Joly just dropped a diplomatic hammer in Beijing, a move so blunt and so public that it immediately undercut Donald Trump's leverage over Canada. In a single press briefing, she reframed Canada's global alliances, declaring that stability and reliability must now come from partners outside the United States. Beijing embraced the message instantly. Washington, meanwhile, was forced to confront a reality it has ignored for years. Ottawa is no longer playing the role Trump accepts. And just like that, Joly's words sent a geopolitical shockwave down the spine of America's trade and energy strategy.
In Beijing, Joly and Energy Minister Tim Hodgson held a detailed press session after a series of high-level meetings with Premier Li Qiang, senior Chinese ministers, and major industrial investors. Their remarks marked the clearest public pivot in Canada-China relations since the diplomatic freeze triggered by the Huawei affair. This time, the tone was not cautious or hedged. It was confident, forward-looking, and deliberately structured to show that Canada is stepping into a new strategic space. Joly described this moment as the beginning of a new era with China. She emphasized that while Canada cannot control global instability, from Venezuela to Iran to the volatility she characterized as south of our border, it can control who it chooses as economic partners. She framed the trip as a mission to create stability for Canadian workers and industries by diversifying markets and securing investment beyond a turbulent United States. Hodgson reinforced that message by unveiling 8 new agreements signed during the trip, covering energy technology, construction materials, and clean power deployment. He highlighted China's role as a major investor in Canadian oil sands and LNG, and made it clear that Beijing wants more. Most notably, Chinese officials told Canada they seek a new strategic partnership, language not heard in over a decade.
Joly's remarks landed with such force because they broke an unwritten rule in North American diplomacy. Canada rarely calls out U.S. instability in public. Yet here she was, in Beijing, stating on record that the United States is no longer a predictable partner. For a government led by Donald Trump, whose tariff swings and economic ultimatums have rattled allies since 2025, this was more than a diplomatic jab. It was a direct rejection of Washington's assumption that Canada has no alternative. Canada's pivot did not come out of nowhere. Over the past year, Trump has used tariffs as a governing instrument, raising duties on autos, critical minerals, aluminum, and certain industrial inputs from Canada. He has threatened to block Canadian vehicles from the U.S. market. He has openly mused about using energy access as a pressure tool. For Canadian policymakers, that created a structural vulnerability that could not be ignored. Joly's line about focusing on what we can control was a coded way of saying Canada can no longer afford to rely solely on the United States.
Hodgson's comments added another layer. His statement that China wants partners who don't use energy for coercion was a thinly veiled critique of Trump's approach. The United States, under Trump's second term, has attempted to pressure allies by slowing down cross-border energy approvals and using export permits as leverage. By contrast, China has doubled down on long-term energy agreements, from LNG partnerships to clean power deployments, offering the exact stability Canada says it needs. This isn't just rhetoric. Canada has the lowest carbon intensity LNG in the world, and that aligns perfectly with China's need to reduce emissions without sacrificing industrial output. If China increases long-term purchases of Canadian LNG, Ottawa gains strategic flexibility, while Washington loses a key point of leverage. And with the Trans Mountain expansion now fully operational, Canada has the infrastructure to send more energy westward, bypassing U.S. bottlenecks. What makes this moment even more destabilizing for Washington is the symbolism behind it. Trump has framed energy dominance as a national security tool, a way to discipline allies and reward loyalty. But Canada signaling that it prefers China's consistency over America's volatility flips that narrative upside down. For Beijing, gaining stable access to Canadian LNG weakens U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific. For Ottawa, securing Asian buyers ensures that no U.S. administration can choke off Canada's energy revenues again. It is not simply an energy deal. It is a redistribution of leverage in the North American system, and Trump cannot ignore that.
The auto sector adds another dimension. Joly acknowledged that Canadian auto workers are deeply worried about the volatility coming from U.S. politics. Trump's threats to penalize foreign-made EVs and reverse cross-border supply chains have unnerved the entire industry. In response, Canada is developing a new auto strategy designed to pull investment not just from Korea and Germany, but increasingly from China, the global EV leader. If Canada succeeds in building even part of its EV supply chain independently of the U.S., Trump's ability to dictate terms in North America weakens significantly. China, for its part, sees the opening clearly. Its officials described the Canada relationship as having undergone a full turnaround. They framed this pivot as mutually beneficial but strategically timed. In a world where the U.S. is applying pressure through tariffs, sanctions, and political unpredictability, China can position itself as the stable counterweight, and Canada, a G7 economy with vast energy resources and growing clean tech potential, is a highly valuable partner. This moment also has broader geopolitical implications. Trump's team has worked under the assumption that Western allies dissatisfied with China would naturally align behind Washington. But Canada is showing that alignment with the U.S. cannot rely purely on sentiment. It must rely on stability and economic logic. If the United States cannot provide that stability, other partners will. China's rapid response and willingness to sign multiple agreements in a single day show that Beijing is capitalizing on Trump-induced fractures within the Western bloc. For Canadian workers, the message is simple. Diversification is no longer a luxury, it is economic survival. For American policymakers, the message is far more uncomfortable. Canada is moving, and the U.S. cannot stop it with tariffs alone.
Canada's Beijing mission marks a turning point. Joly and Hodgson were not simply announcing deals, they were signaling a geopolitical reset. By declaring publicly that stability no longer comes from the United States, Canada has shifted the balance of North American politics. Trump's reaction will likely be loud, but the deeper issue is structural. Washington now faces a partner that is no longer dependent, no longer predictable, and no longer willing to absorb economic shocks for the sake of the alliance. The road ahead is clear. China wants more Canadian energy, Canada wants more stable markets, and Trump wants to reassert control at a moment when that control is slipping.
How would you rate Mark Carney's first year as Prime Minister?
Historic. Mark Carney was not in politics. And this is why I say it's historic. No one, underscore no one, has ever come off the sidelines out of political obscurity to become Prime Minister. It's never happened.
Canada has just delivered a political milestone no one, not Washington, not Ottawa, and certainly not Donald Trump, expected to see this year. Mark Carney's first 12 months as Prime Minister didn't simply go well. They shattered every prediction, every assumption, and every political pattern the country thought it understood. Veteran strategist Scott Reed called the year historic, and when you look closely at what Carney walked into, what he faced, and how he responded, historic might actually be too modest. Because this wasn't just a successful first year, it was a national reset.
When 2025 began, Canada's political scene was unraveling. The governing Liberals were divided, confidence was collapsing, and Justin Trudeau was facing unprecedented pressure inside his own caucus. His finance minister had resigned. Senior MPs were worried about how Canada would handle Donald Trump's intensifying tariff measures, and the country's economic future felt increasingly fragile. In that moment of uncertainty, Mark Carney, a man who had never run for office, stepped into the arena. He had global economic credentials, decades of crisis management experience, and the reputation of someone who understood how to navigate turbulent markets. But he had no political machine, no parliamentary history, and no one believed a newcomer could win an election against an opposition party leading by more than 20 points. Yet within a few months, the entire landscape flipped. Trudeau bowed out. Carney took the Liberal leadership with relative ease. The Conservative lead evaporated during the campaign, and Carney, the supposed outsider, became the first Prime Minister in Canadian history to reach office without prior electoral experience. And hovering over all of this was the same force that had accelerated the political shift in Ottawa, Donald Trump's tariff crusade against Canada. As the U.S. unleashed economic pressure across steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, and energy, Canadians began searching for someone who could match the moment. And in Carney, they found exactly that. Carney didn't inherit a calm country. He inherited a Canada under economic and diplomatic siege. Trump had reignited the tariff war with new intensity. Ontario was scrambling to respond to sudden shifts in auto manufacturing. Exporters were facing spiraling uncertainty, and U.S.-Canada relations were drifting toward their lowest point in decades. Instead of playing defense, Carney did something Canadian leaders haven't always been confident enough to do. He took control of the narrative. He moved quickly to stabilize relations abroad. He re-established Canada as a serious player in international economic forums. He announced major investments in defense, clean energy, and industrial competitiveness, decisions that signaled Canada was no longer interested in operating as a passive middle power waiting for the United States to set the terms. He made clear that the country would not chase last-minute side deals with Washington, particularly with the next USMCA review approaching. If the United States wanted concessions, Canada would negotiate from a position of strength, not desperation. What makes this year historic is not simply that Carney survived an unpredictable political transition. It is that he arrived during a moment of crisis and used the crisis to elevate Canada's sense of agency. He reminded Canadians that their country is not merely the junior partner in North America. It is a nation with its own interests, its own leverage, and increasingly, its own global alliances.
One of the most revealing parts of Scott Reed's analysis was his observation that Trump's tariff storm was a central force shaping Canada's political realignment. Trump didn't just apply economic pressure, he unintentionally created the conditions that led to Carney's rise. By escalating trade disputes, undermining long-standing cooperation, and threatening key sectors of the Canadian economy, Trump heightened the stakes for domestic leadership. Trudeau's government, already strained, couldn't withstand that pressure. The public mood shifted towards someone perceived as competent, steady, and internationally credible, and that person happened to be Mark Carney. This is the strategic backfire of the year. Trump's attempt to pressure Canada ended up producing the prime minister most capable of resisting him. Carney's background in global finance, his relationships with world leaders, and his ability to navigate volatility became exactly what Canada needed in a hyper-fractured geopolitical moment. Throughout the year, the contrast between Carney's methodical approach and Trump's confrontational style became impossible to miss. While Trump cut off trade talks after Doug Ford's anti-tariff ad went viral, Carney continued building partnerships across Asia, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific. While Washington doubled down on unilateralism, Canada expanded defense cooperation with South Korea, strengthened ties with Japan, and reopened high-level dialogue with China. The message was unmistakable. Canada is diversifying its influence, not waiting for Washington's permission. And here's the deeper irony. Trump's aggressive posture forced Canada to accelerate decisions it had postponed for years, modernizing defense spending, investing in energy independence, and rebuilding manufacturing capability. Without Trump's pressure, those structural shifts might have taken another decade. Instead, they became urgent national priorities, and Carney was the only leader positioned to execute them coherently. In attempting to weaken Canada's footing, Trump unintentionally pushed Canada into a more assertive, globally anchored, and economically resilient trajectory.
Something else shifted this year, something deeper than politics. Canadians became more assertive about their economic sovereignty. They voiced frustration about U.S. unpredictability. They supported a government willing to stand its ground rather than negotiate under pressure. Carney tapped directly into that shift. His message wasn't ideological. It wasn't framed as left or right. It was pragmatic. Canada needs stability, credibility, and independence in a world dominated by geopolitical shocks. He positioned Canada not as a country reacting to Trump's agenda, but as a country shaping its own.
And for the first time in years, Canadians seemed to feel that the federal government was not simply managing crises, but anticipating them. That confidence is why Carney's first year matters. It reflects a broader evolution in how Canada sees its role, its leverage, and its future. More importantly, it signaled a cultural shift. Canadians no longer view themselves as passengers in North America's political turbulence. Under Carney, the country is beginning to act like a nation that expects to influence outcomes, not merely absorb them. This renewed sense of agency is becoming a defining feature of Canada's modern identity. Mark Carney's first year as Prime Minister defied the odds because Canada itself defied the odds. Under enormous pressure from Donald Trump's tariff strategy, the country didn't fold. It adapted. It recalibrated. It elevated a leader with global experience and used that experience to reinforce national confidence at a moment of unprecedented instability. As the 2026 USMCA review approaches and Trump prepares his next set of demands, a different North America is emerging, one where Canada negotiates from strength, not fear. And now the question is no longer whether Carney can handle Trump's pressure. The real question is whether Washington is ready for a Canada that refuses to be underestimated ever again.
A new U.S. tariff threat, this time focusing on Canadian fertilizer.
A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here. And we can do it here.
While Trump provided no specifics on what that severe tariff could look like, it would seriously impact U.S. farmers.
Donald Trump has a new target in his trade war playbook: Canadian potash, the fertilizer that keeps North American agriculture alive. And here's the part Washington is trying very hard not to say out loud. If Trump actually follows through with tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, it won't be Canada that suffers. It will be American farmers, already under pressure from high costs and shrinking margins, who pay the price. Canada walks away stable. The United States walks straight into a crisis of its own making. During a recent Q&A session, Trump floated the idea of imposing what he called very severe tariffs on fertilizer imports, emphasizing that a large share comes from Canada. This threat arrives in the middle of an already turbulent year for American agriculture. Potash prices have been rising globally, U.S. input costs are at record highs, and the Trump administration has been juggling both trade disputes and plans to reshore production that simply does not exist at scale inside the United States. Meanwhile, Canada, under Prime Minister Mark Carney, is expanding its foothold as the world's most reliable supplier of potash. Saskatchewan alone produces a massive share of global output, and according to recent reporting from Reuters, roughly 80% of America's potash imports come from Canada. In other words, Trump is not threatening a marginal supplier. He is threatening the foundation of America's fertilizer supply chain. Before diving into the political fallout, let's look at the structural reality. Canada isn't just a participant in the potash industry. Canada dominates it. Saskatchewan produces more potash than any other place on Earth. When Trump talks about imposing tariffs as a way to push fertilizer production back to the United States, he is speaking as if America has untapped potash reserves waiting to be mined. It doesn't. Canada's supply is unmatched, reliable, and geologically irreplaceable. Cutting it off is like deciding to make gasoline expensive because you want drivers to switch cars. The intention may sound bold, but it does nothing to change the underlying dependence. And beyond simple geology, Canada's advantage comes from decades of long-term planning. Ottawa has treated potash as a strategic export, not a bargaining chip. The country built world-class infrastructure, stable regulatory systems, and long-standing relationships with major agricultural markets. That combination means Canada doesn't flinch when threatened. It simply points to the global demand it already serves, demand that continues to grow as nations scramble for secure fertilizer sources.
This is where the economic reality becomes unavoidable. American farmers cannot grow corn, soybeans, or wheat at competitive yields without potash. Fertilizer isn't optional. It is 20% or more of the cost structure of a typical corn operation. Potash is the core element that keeps soil fertile, and right now the United States has no alternative producer capable of meeting national demand. If tariffs push potash prices higher, costs for farmers will jump instantly. Economists in Illinois and Ohio warn that prices could climb by more than $100 per ton if a tariff is enforced. That may sound like a small number in Washington, but for farmers running thousands of acres, it translates into tens of thousands of dollars in unexpected expenses. For many, that wipes out annual profit entirely. For others, it becomes the difference between continuing or closing their operation. We've seen this pattern before. During the trade war with China, soybean farmers watched their markets collapse. Now, the same administration is flirting with a policy that would raise the cost of the fertilizer those same farmers depend on. And here's the most revealing detail. The U.S. government already had to announce a $12 billion farm relief program this month to offset losses tied to trade conflicts. If potash tariffs hit, that bailout number could easily double. While Trump threatens tariffs, Canada is doing the opposite. Ottawa is positioning Canada as the world's dependable provider of critical minerals. The Carney government has been expanding partnerships with Asia, reinforcing supply chains with Europe, and accelerating investment in Saskatchewan's potash sector. When global markets look for stability in fertilizer supply, they look to Canada, not because Canada demands attention, but because Canada delivers reliability. If the United States chooses to make potash more expensive for itself, Canada will not be scrambling to find customers. India, Brazil, Indonesia, and much of Europe are standing in line. A tariff doesn't weaken Canada. It simply redirects exports to markets that are already eager to buy. There's another angle Trump's team cannot ignore. His political base is deeply rural. Farmers, especially in the Midwest, are key to his electoral coalition. But those same farmers are the ones who stand to lose the most. They rely on affordable potash. They rely on stable supply. They rely on Canada far more than Washington likes to admit. Trump may talk about protecting American workers, but potash is not like steel or aluminum. You can't build a new mine in 2 years. You can't flip a switch and reshore a mineral deposit. Fertilizer is geology, not politics. The people who understand that live in farm country, not in front of television cameras. If tariffs go forward, Trump risks forcing his own supporters into deeper financial strain. The images that will come out of rural America won't be stories of strength. They will be farmers explaining why they can no longer absorb skyrocketing fertilizer bills. The world is entering a decade where food security equals national security. Two major potash exporters, Russia and Belarus, are constrained by sanctions and geopolitical tensions. That leaves Canada as the one major stable supplier. Countries are already shifting long-term contracts toward Canada because it is predictable, democratic, and insulated from geopolitical shocks. If the U.S. undermines its relationship with Canada, it accelerates a trend already underway. Global buyers strengthening ties with Ottawa. A tariff would not shrink Canada's influence, it would expand it.
If Trump turns Canadian potash into the next battlefield of his trade war, the political theater may look dramatic, but the economic reality is simple. American fertilizer prices will surge, farm incomes will sink, bailout spending will climb, food production will face new risks, and the only country that emerges more stable, more trusted, and more strategically positioned in global agriculture is Canada. The message is clear. When you wage a trade war against the country that supplies the fertilizer beneath your own fields, the boomerang always comes back. So the question for Washington is no longer whether tariffs sound strong. The question is whether America is prepared to sacrifice its own farmers to keep that performance going.
The average price for a new vehicle in the U.S. is now above $50,000 for the first time ever, according to Kelley Blue Book, which noted the all-time high pricing has not stopped electric vehicle sales from soaring. Average transaction prices for new vehicles hit $50,080 in September, the report released Monday found, rising 2.1% from August and 3.6% year-over-year.
U.S. consumers are about to learn a hard truth. When Washington tears up decades of auto cooperation with Canada, the bill doesn't land in Ottawa, it lands right in American driveways. Prices are rising, supply chains are buckling, and the era of seamless North American auto production is slipping away. And the twist that no one expected is that Canada may emerge from this disruption in a far stronger position than many imagined. Today, we break down the fallout of the collapsing auto pact, why Americans are paying more for their vehicles, why Donald Trump's tariff strategy is backfiring, and how Canada is quietly positioning itself as the stable center of gravity in a fractured North American market. In early 2025, President Donald Trump pushed forward with a sweeping series of tariffs on imported vehicles and auto parts coming from Canada and Mexico. Verified by Reuters reporting, the White House framed the move as a jobs-first reshoring strategy meant to force automakers to expand domestic production inside the United States. But instead of boosting American factories, the tariffs detonated a supply chain crisis that ripped through a deeply integrated industry. For decades, a car assembled in Ontario might rely on engines from Michigan, sensors from Mexico, transmissions cast in Windsor, and software coded in Waterloo. These components crossed borders multiple times before a finished car ever reached a dealership. It was an ecosystem built on efficiency, trust, and open borders. Trump's tariff wall shattered that ecosystem in an instant. Parts that once flowed effortlessly are now slowed by inspections, duties, and unpredictable cost surges. U.S. factories that depend on Canadian-made components are scaling back shifts. Automakers warned that Americans could soon pay $5,000 to $15,000 more for certain vehicles, a figure widely cited in Bloomberg and Reuters industry analysis. Meanwhile, Ottawa's reaction was swift and strategic. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that the tariffs mark the end of deep economic integration with the United States, signaling that Canada is no longer willing to accept instability as the price of partnership. The auto pact didn't just weaken, it effectively collapsed. The consequences inside the United States are hitting faster and harder than Washington expected. Prices on dealership lots are rising. Inventories are thinning out as factories struggle to secure the Canadian and Mexican components they relied on for decades. Even companies considered resilient, like Tesla and Ford, now acknowledge higher production costs tied directly to cross-border disruption. The irony is glaring. Tariffs were supposed to protect American auto workers, yet the bottlenecks they created are causing slowdowns and potential layoffs. Confidential industry briefings referenced by Reuters show a quiet admission across Detroit. The Canadian supply chain cannot be reproduced overnight. Replacing it with purely domestic inputs is not realistic without billions in new investment and many years of rebuilding. In other words, the United States engineered a crisis it was never prepared to manage. And within Washington, there is growing recognition that this approach has boxed America in. Lawmakers privately concede the U.S. overestimated its capacity to go it alone while underestimating Canada's central role in advanced manufacturing. The result is a political narrative collapsing under economic reality.
Canada's response stands in stark contrast. Rather than panic, the Carney government treated the crisis as an opportunity to pivot. Ottawa accelerated trade diversification, expanding negotiations with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN to open new markets for Canadian auto parts and EV technologies. At the same time, Canada rolled out powerful industrial incentives, including clean manufacturing tax credits, productivity superdeductions, and fast-track approvals for large-scale battery and critical mineral projects. The message to global automakers was simple. If you need stability, predictability, and access to clean energy, Canada is the place to build.
While the U.S. is tied up in constitutional lawsuits over Trump's emergency tariff powers, Canada is offering certainty, and global automakers are paying attention. Several are now reevaluating long-term North American investment plans, asking, for the first time in decades, whether Canada is the safer and more profitable bet. Executives visiting Ottawa in recent months have described Canada as the Switzerland of North American manufacturing, a jurisdiction where policy doesn't swing wildly with every election cycle. That perception alone is shifting billions in future capital allocation.
This isn't just a trade story, it's a geopolitical shift. For years, Washington assumed Canada needed the United States more than the United States needed Canada. But the supply chain chaos triggered by the tariffs has revealed the opposite. American manufacturing is deeply dependent on Canadian engineering, minerals, and components. Canada, meanwhile, has options. With deepening ties to South Korea, Japan, the EU, and emerging Indo-Pacific partners, confirmed by multiple analyses across CBC and Reuters, Ottawa is designing a new economic architecture that is less reliant on America's political mood swings. Trump may have intended to pressure Canada into concessions, but the result is that Canada is now accelerating its path toward independence and diversification. The fundamental reason American buyers feel the consequences more sharply is structural. U.S. consumers purchase more imported vehicles per capita than Canadians, and U.S. automakers depend more heavily on Canadian components than the reverse. Canada's diversified export network gives it room to maneuver, while U.S. buyers are locked into a market suddenly constrained by tariffs. And where Ottawa has responded with coordinated policy action, Washington's approach has been reactive, fragmented, and politically volatile. In short, when the Auto Pact breaks, Canada shifts sideways. The United States gets hit head-on. What we are witnessing is the flipping of a long-standing assumption. For decades, the U.S. believed it held all the leverage in North American manufacturing. Yet as supply chains fracture and prices soar, it is Canada, with its minerals, clean energy, advanced manufacturing, and global trade links, that now looks like the indispensable partner. By deepening alliances with the Indo-Pacific and the EU, and by securing new industrial investments, Canada is no longer reacting to U.S. decisions. It is charting its own path. Trump's tariffs were meant to strengthen America's hand. Instead, they strengthened Canada's resolve. The fallout from the collapsing Auto Pact is more than an economic disruption. It is a strategic turning point. American consumers are paying higher prices, U.S. factories are scrambling for parts, and Canada, long seen as the junior partner in the North American auto economy, is now emerging as a stable, credible, and increasingly influential player. As we move closer to the 2026 USMCA review, one question now hangs over the continent. If this is what happens when the U.S. chooses confrontation, what happens when Canada finally decides it no longer needs to play by America's script?